Committee on State Foreign Operations and Related Programs will come to order. Mr. Secretary, I want to welcome you back to the subcommittee. We're looking forward to your statement. You recently noted that while funding for international programs represents just 1% of the total federal budget, it may well define the majority of the history written about our era. Members of this subcommittee certainly understand the importance of these programs. The United States continues to show leadership in areas such as reducing poverty, fighting the AIDS virus, and stopping preventable deaths of mothers and children. However, there are countless security challenges around the world that grab the headlines every day. At the top of the list is the crisis in Syria and the surrounding region, which is being fueled by the Assad regime, ISIL, and other terrorist groups. This situation has grown more complicated due to Russia's increased involvement, and we want to hear your thoughts about the situation on the ground. We also are concerned that our allies and partners in the fight against terrorism, such as Egypt, Jordan, and the Kurds in Iraq, are not receiving the assistance they need. While there has been some improvement since I raised this issue with you last year, I want to reiterate that there is no excuse for bureaucratic delays. It's also critical that our policies promote our national security interests and not undermine them. I question why the administration plans to phase out the cash flow financing arrangement for military sales in Egypt, which is one of the most reliable partners of ours in the Middle East. We also must demonstrate our steadfast support to help Israel address the threats posed by Iran and its proxies. Now that a nuclear agreement is in place, we're all closely watching Iran's actions. You said that some of the funds freed up from the sanctions relief could end up in the hands of terrorists. The threat to Israel is very serious. As you negotiate another long-term memorandum of understanding, it must be made clear that the U.S. support for Israel's security is unequivocal. Another troubling development is the increased violence in Israel and the Palestinian territories over the last several months. We want to hear your thoughts about the prospects for getting the parties back to the negotiating table. We also want to hear what the United States can do to help stop harmful rhetoric and incitement. I want to turn next to Russia's aggressive actions against its neighbors. Many of us don't understand why Ukraine has not received lethal military aid or why the State Department budget proposes to reduce assistance to Ukraine by 55% from last year's level. We also see China asserting itself against the United States and our friends and allies in the Asia-Pacific region. We want to hear how this budget supports countries willing to stand up to China when their territory is threatened. We also watch with great concern as North Korea continues to defy international sanctions. We want to hear your thoughts on what more can be done to stop this rogue nation from its nuclear pursuits. In Afghanistan, a resurgent Taliban and a growing number of foreign fighters continue to threaten the country's security. We question how the $1.2 billion of foreign assistance requested can be effectively programmed in this environment. In the Americas, we see drug and gang violence, human trafficking, and lack of economic opportunity continuing to drive migration to the United States. The subcommittee held a hearing 2 weeks ago on assistance to Central America, where we look at these issues. We must see results before new funds can be considered. We're also monitoring the new public health threat from the Zika virus spreading in this hemisphere and received the supplemental request on Monday. This committee has provided significant funding and the flexibility to address global health threats, and we want to hear how the administration will immediately address the Zika outbreak. We have additional questions about the administration's budget request for the State Department and foreign assistance programs. The total funding requested is roughly last year's level, but you propose to cut programs that have bipartisan support, such as security assistance and humanitarian programs. At the same time, we see an increase is requested for administration priorities, such as funding to combat climate change. One area that we all agree is a priority is preserving the safety and security of our nation's diplomats and development officers. This subcommittee must be sure that funds provided will keep our people safe. In closing, I want to thank you and the men and women of the State Department and the USAID for your work in promoting American interests abroad. We may not always agree on the policy or the means to achieve these goals, but the members of this subcommittee understand the need to engage with all the tools we have available. It's now my turn to my ranking member and friend, Mrs. Lowy, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Secretary Kerry. It's a pleasure to welcome you before our subcommittee. Since you were sworn into office, the world has witnessed unprecedented levels of turmoil, requiring strong U.S. leadership on many fronts. Chief among them is the Middle East, and I do commend your attempts to bring about a ceasefire in Syria. However, as recent events prove, this requires the cooperation of Russia and Iran. I look forward to hearing your estimation of what it will take for both countries to work with the international community to end the senseless bloodshed and atrocities of the Assad regime, and specifically whether we have the leverage to end the conflict. To continue on Iran, despite differing opinions on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, it must be vigilantly enforced in combination with other sustained efforts to prevent Iran from ever developing nuclear weapons. The international community must have mechanisms in place to thwart Iran's destabilizing behavior in the region, particularly its ability to fund terrorists and export weapons to various proxies. It is critical this committee understand how the administration will address these concerns and meet its commitment to bolster the security of our allies in the region, particularly Israel. These concerns are heightened with recent sanctions relief for the regime and on the heels of the first shipment in 3 years of Iranian oil to Europe last week. In addition to threats from Iran, Israel is threatened by radical extremism on several borders and combats almost daily terrorist attacks by Palestinians. President Abbas has yet to condemn the shootings, car rammings, stabbings against innocent Israelis, yet he meets with terrorist families. Such behavior only incites more violence and makes the goal of 2 states for 2 people even more difficult to achieve. It has also been reported in the media that there have been talks between Fatah and Hamas to establish a new unity government. American support is predicated upon the Palestinian leaders' commitment to resolving all outstanding issues through direct negotiations, which cannot progress if one party refuses to abide by the Oslo conditions of recognizing Israel, renouncing violence, and abiding by previous commitments. A unity government with an unreformed Hamas would be an unacceptable impediment to peace. As intractable as the conflict may be, I want to thank you for your efforts in trying to bring the parties together for a 2-state solution, and I hope you will reassure us that the administration will maintain its indispensable role of mediator and veto any resolution before the United Nations in keeping with long-standing policy to defend Israel at the UN. With regard to the fiscal year 2017 budget request, I am pleased it includes strong economic and security assistance for Eastern Europe to combat Russian aggression and for Central America to address the root causes of child and family migration. Continuing our investments to combat climate change, poverty, and disease. This is critical, yet the request reduces humanitarian and disaster assistance by more than $1 billion. With unprecedented human suffering and humanitarian needs around the world, I want to hear your rationale for such a reduction. Mr. Secretary, I share your concern that much of the department's core programs are currently funded through Overseas Contingency Operations, or OCO, which inaccurately reflects our commitment to key partners, international organizations, and humanitarian operations. Diplomacy and development are critical components of our national security. Diplomatic failure increases the risk of conflict or failed states and makes populations more vulnerable to radicalization. Congress must find a more responsible budgeting method to provide the resources to meet these challenges today, tomorrow, and into the future. And finally, I must state yet again my deep frustration with the administration's failure to prioritize international basic education. With more than 120 million children and adolescents currently out of school, the administration proposed cut of $240 million from the amount appropriated by Congress makes 0 sense. We cannot make sustained progress on any of our development goals, from health to growing economies, food security, to building democratic institutions, if generations of children grow up without basic literacy skills. In fact, the White House's own initiative, Let Girls Learn, will be impossible to implement with this unacceptably low funding request. Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you again. Thank you for your service to our country. Thank you for your testimony here today and your stalwart efforts to advance American priorities around the world. Thank you.
I'll now yield to Chairman Rogers for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, good to see you. Thank you for being here to justify your budget request for 2017, both for the Department and Foreign Operations. The importance of U.S. leadership in global affairs could never be more pronounced than now. Your job to promote American interests abroad, to pursue peace in regions wrought by hundreds of years of historical and cultural strife, your job to ensure the safety of our people, our citizens living here and abroad, all of this is of paramount importance at a time when the world could not be more insecure. I echo the concerns our leaders have just voiced about ISIS and our need for a comprehensive plan to dismantle this merciless terrorist organization who've senselessly killed thousands of innocent women and children in horrible, horrific examples of hate and prejudice. They will stop at nothing to infiltrate this country and its allies, and we need to provide the American people with a degree of comfort that the tragic events that transpired in San Bernardino cannot and will not be repeated on our soil, and the State Department needs to play a role in that effort. On the international level, the President has rightfully solicited the support of other nations in dismantling ISIS. Coordination will be key to defeating this shared foe, and the U.S. must support our allies in this effort. I echo the chairwoman's sentiment that any assistance to our friends must be delivered in due haste. I fear that countries like Russia are all too eager to fill a perceived vacuum in American leadership, and I hope you can address that concern here today, particularly as Russia continues to pursue aggressive maneuvers against its neighbors. With that in mind, let me echo the Chair's support for Ukraine. The U.S. should support Ukraine during these tough economic times and continue to assist in efforts to protect their sovereignty. And we must provide, Mr. Secretary, the legal, lethal, military aid this Congress has supported, and yet we see it being withheld. We want to ask you why. Turning to issues that concern our closest ally in the Middle East, Israel, first, we must maintain strong oversight over the nuclear of Iran, stability in the region, which is tenuous on a good day, depends on holding Iran accountable for its actions. I think most people in this room would agree that taking our soldiers hostage and testing a ballistic missile immediately after the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Agreement went into effect was a bad start, to say the least. I hope you'll provide us with an update today about the administration's efforts to make sure Iran lives up to its side of the agreement and what tools we have at our disposal if they don't. And I would remind the Secretary that just as this committee and the Congress controls the power of the purse, the Secretary has a purse to power control as well around the world. And we hope that that leverage is properly used, but used. Another matter that troubles our friends in Israel is the spike in violence and harmful rhetoric. We know you have very close relationships with leaders in the region. We want to know what you are personally doing to dial back this incitement and restore some measure of peace in this troubled territory. No aid should go directly to the Palestinian Authority unless the matter of incitement that's in our bill is addressed. Finally, Mr. Secretary, let me talk a moment about Zika. And I've shared these thoughts with OMB Director Donovan yesterday and others involved, but they bear repeating somewhat here. I'm very disappointed, Mr. Secretary, that the administration didn't take our committee's recommendation to use unobligated funds laying there, unused, for the immediate response to Zika. Now, you've asked for a supplemental request, and we're prepared to look at it carefully. But in the meantime, as an emergency measure, you've got monies laying there. Go ahead and use it. You have our authority and our permission, and hopefully our direction, to go ahead and use, at least temporarily, the funds laying there that are not being used for Zika. And it's when we authorized and appropriated the funds for Ebola a couple of years ago, we purposefully left the ability to use those funds for other diseases as well. And so we got another disease, Zika. Let's go ahead and use the funds that you have. And then if that proves to be inadequate, we can always go back to a supplemental. So, can we talk? Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Secretary Kerry, please proceed with your opening remarks. There is a full panel of the members here today, and they have a lot of issues they'd like to discuss with you. So I would encourage you to summarize your remarks so we have time to address all of their questions. A yellow light on your timer will appear when you have 2 minutes left.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman, and Ranking Member Lowy, and Mr. Chairman Rogers of the full committee, all the members. Thank you very much. My apologies for being late. I had a phone call that came in that I had to take at the last minute, and I apologize for keeping any of you waiting. Look, I want to just start by saying we really appreciate your tremendous work with us last year on a bipartisan basis to approve a budget that really does reflect our core national security needs. And I really look forward, this is the last budget of the Obama administration, and I look forward to a collaborative effort again this year because, as the Chairwoman said and as Chairman Rogers said, we've got this vast array of challenges, unprecedented in terms of time. I must say I blanched a little when you said since you've been sworn in, there's been an unprecedented amount of turmoil. I hope that you weren't inferring that that was because I was sworn in. But obviously, we're facing challenges, needless to say. Let me just say that $50 billion is the total request when you add the OCO and the core elements and the AID. It's equal to about 1% of the federal budget. And it is frankly the minimum price of leadership at a time when America is diplomatically engaged more deeply than at any time, I think, in history, in more places at the same time. The scope of our engagement is absolutely essential in order to protect American interests, protect our communities, keep our citizens safe. We're confronted by perils that are as old as nationalist aggression and as new as cyber warfare, by dictators who run roughshod over global norms and some who change their constitutions at the last minute to stay in office beyond the requisite periods of time and cause violence by doing so, by violent extremists who combine modern media with medieval thinking to wage war on civilization itself. And despite the dangers, I believe deeply that we have many, many reasons for confidence as Americans. In recent years, our economy has added more jobs than the rest of the industrialized world combined. Our armed forces are second to none, and it's not even close. Our alliances in Europe and Asia are vigilant and strong and growing stronger with the passage of the TPP. And our citizens are unmatched in the generosity of their commitment to humanitarian causes and civil society. We are the largest donor in the world to the crisis of Syrian refugees, over $5.1 billion. We can be proud of that. We see and hear a lot of hand-wringing today, but I have to tell you, with all of my affection and the relationships that for many of my colleagues and the relationships I've built around the world and my respect for the jobs that they do, I wouldn't switch places with one foreign minister in the world. I believe, nor would I frankly retreat to some illusionary sense of a golden age of the past. There are so many things that are happening in the world that are positive and constructive. Massive numbers of people brought into the middle class. Diseases being defeated on the brink of, because of our efforts, a generation being born free of AIDS in Africa. I mean, this is extraordinary. And there are great opportunities staring us in the face in terms of the energy future and other possibilities, the largest market in the world, frankly. In the past year, we reached an historic multilateral accord with Iran that has cut off each of that country's pathways to a nuclear weapon, thereby immediately making the world safer for our allies and for us. And I will note that the general in charge of the Israeli Defense Forces, General Ashkar, just the other day, made a speech in which he said that the existential threat to Israel from Iran has been eliminated. That's the chief of the IDF in Israel saying that himself. In Paris in December, we joined governments from more than 190 nations. No easy task to get 190 nations to agree on something, but they approved a comprehensive agreement to curb greenhouse gas emissions and limit the most harmful consequences of climate change. Now we're determined to implement that accord and do everything possible to reduce the carbon pollution and grow economies at the same time, and we believe it is not a choice between one or the other. Just this month, we officially signed the Trans-Pacific Partnership to ensure a level playing field for American businesses and workers, to reassert U.S. leadership in a region that is vital to our interests, and it will cut over 18,000 taxes on Americans' goods that move into that region. We are asking Congress to approve that this year so we can begin to accrue its benefits as quickly as possible. In Europe, we are increasing support for our Security Reassurance Initiative. We are increasing it fourfold and giving Russia a clear choice between continued sanctions or meeting its obligations to a sovereign and democratic Ukraine. In our hemisphere, we're helping Colombia to end the globe's longest-running civil conflict, and we're aiding our partners in Central America to implement reforms and reduce pressures for illegal migration. In Asia, we're standing with our allies in opposition to threats posed by belligerent North Korea, and we're on the brink of achieving a strong United Nations Security Council resolution, which is now both in Beijing and Washington for approval. We are working with Afghanistan and Pakistan to counter violent extremism, deepening our strategic dialogue with India, supporting democratic gains in Sri Lanka and Burma, and encouraging the peaceful resolution of competing maritime claims in the South China Sea. And with friends in fast-growing Africa, we have embarked on initiatives to combat hunger, to increase connectivity, to empower women, to train future leaders and fight back against such terrorist groups as Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram. Of course, we recognize that the threat posed by violent extremism extends far beyond any one region. You mentioned, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, the issue of education. and it is not going to be solved primarily by military means. So the approach we have adopted is comprehensive, and it's long-term. Diplomatically, we're striving to end conflicts that fuel extremism, such as those of Libya and Yemen. We are deeply involved in trying to resolve both. But we also work with partners more broadly to share intelligence, to tighten border security, improve governance, expand access to education, and promote job training and development. And we have forged a 66-member coalition, an international coalition to defeat the terrorist group Daesh, and I am absolutely confident we are going to do that. Well, let me just say quickly that the most critical thing, obviously, on the table at this moment in terms of this conflict resolution is the effort with Russia and Syria. We can talk about it a little bit in our questions, I'm sure. But I talked this morning, the reason I'm late, I was talking with Foreign Minister Lavrov, and we have a team that will be meeting in the next day or so, the task force for the ceasefire, cessation of hostilities. And we are, I'm not here to vouch that it's absolutely going to work or it's, but I'm telling you this is the one way that we can end this war. The alternative is that the war gets worse, that Syria might be totally destroyed, not able to be put back together again. Everybody has said you've got to have a diplomatic solution at some point in time. The question will be, is it ripe? Will Russia work in good faith? Will Iran work in good faith to try to bring about the political transition that the Geneva Communique calls for? I just want to close by saying to everybody that I have been profoundly privileged to have the chance to work with all of you in support of an agenda that I believe reflects not only the most fundamental values and aspirations of the American people, but also carries with it, I am absolutely confident, the hopes of the world. That's the responsibility that you all have. That's what we're going to be talking about this morning, and I thank you very much for your forbearance, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start the questions, and I'd like to return to the topic, one of the topics I raised in my opening statement concerning the delays in delivery of the U.S. security assistance. The administration has asked our friends and allies to step up and play a greater role in the fight against ISIL, yet we need to do more to deliver our commitments to support them. The current foreign military financing and sale processes are cumbersome and bogged down by bureaucracy, and the problems continue. I hear complaints about equipment delays to our partners, for example, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Egypt, and that's why the fiscal year 2016 appropriations bill directed the Government Accountability Office to review this process and make recommendations. Mr. Secretary, what are you doing to expedite the delivery of important equipment to our friends and allies fighting ISIL, and what more needs to be done to this system?
Well, the whole procurement system could be sped up, and that's a huge challenge for the appropriations committees and, frankly, the Pentagon and procurement process itself, together with the State Department and the White House. We try to move it as fast as we can. I can assure you, over the past year, we have seen unprecedented stress put on our security assistance mechanisms, and frankly, we've seen them respond pretty efficiently and pretty quickly. We are currently providing expedited assistance to Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other counter-ISIL coalition members. And I can go through a long list. I mean, we've provided the Peshmerga with more than 65 million rounds of rifle ammunition, 41,000 grenades, 115,000 mortar rounds, 62,000 anti-tank rounds, including 1,000 AT-4s, more than 56,000 RPG rounds, 35,000 weapons, including rifles, anti-tank systems, heavy caliber machine guns, counter-IED equipment, more than 150 vehicles, ambulances, mine-resistant vehicles. Additional equipment is on the way, 5 million rounds of more rifle ammunition. That's just the Kurds. In terms of Jordan, we continue expedited. We've delivered over...
I don't mean to interrupt you.
Well, I just want to point out that
Right.
we are in a massive process of providing materials. Now, we have created a special task force with the GCC countries, And I have met with them on the 3 occasions now, I think, and we're going to be meeting again in the next weeks. And we have set up a special office within the State Department for the specific purposes of expediting materials to our allies and coalition partners, precisely to be able to respond to any activities by other countries in the region, Iran or otherwise, but also to help them in terms of their coalition efforts. So I just have to tell you, everybody is cranking full speed. We are doing what we can, but as you know, we do have some budget limitations.
You were speaking of the Kurds. The 2 that I hear the most from is Ukraine and what their requests for weapons to defend themselves, and then the Kurds. But the Kurds, the situation right now, the immediate crisis has to do with the price of oil and the flood of refugees. And it is a crisis from everything that we have been told. What can we do to help them stabilize their economy and get them the equipment they need to fight ISIL? And I still hear continually the fact that the aid for the Kurds has to go through Iraq. That 17% just doesn't get there, and it doesn't get there in time to be helpful. So what else can we do?
I have heard that, Madam Chair, about the question of some siphoning off. I don't know. I don't have specific evidence of it, but I have heard these allegations, and we have a team working. The embassy in Baghdad is working very, very closely. It is a fact, indeed, that U.S. military assistance has to go through the central government, and that's required both by Iraqi law and by international law. And the reason for that is that we have, part of our policy has been to try to strengthen the central government of Iraq and not to encourage a break-off or the belief that the independent entities within the country can deal directly with the United States or other countries. So in order to strengthen Iraq, that has been the rule. But I will tell you that massive amount of effort now is getting to the Kurds. And the Kurds, frankly, have been quite extraordinary in their efforts to help fight ISIL.
They have.
We need to say thank you to them. They've been, and we're training and working with them right now with respect to the preparations for Mosul, and that will continue.
Thank you. Mrs. Lowy?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome again. And with appreciation, we welcome you for all your hard work. Mr. Secretary, I know how hard you have been working and how many hours you spent on the Israel-Palestinian peace process, and I share your deep frustration that the 2 sides are not sitting down face to face. And just last week, the Palestinian Authority Foreign Minister Riyad al-Malki said, quote, "We'll never go back and sit again in a direct Israeli-Palestinian negotiation." And now, once again, we see the international community attempt to step in and impose a solution on the parties, with the French proposal that includes the stipulation that if the talks fail, it would result in full recognition of a Palestinian state. I won't repeat all the terms of Oslo. You know them inside and out. So few quick questions. I don't know how quick, but according to the time, what is our position on the French proposal? What are you doing to oppose such one-sided actions by international actors? If the Palestinians believe that the international community will pressure Israel for them, what incentive do the Palestinians have to negotiate with Israel and engage in compromise? And what is the administration doing to convince the PA that they cannot refuse direct face-to-face negotiations and disavow them of the notion that the international community will impose a Palestinian state on Israel? Do we have any influence with the PA leadership at this point?
Well, I like to think some, but I think it's very difficult right now on all sides, to be honest with you. I think that, first of all, we do oppose unilateral efforts. But what's happening now is there's a multilateral movement that is growing that is concerned about any number of things. And I was just in Amman a couple of days ago. I met with President Abbas and encouraged him, obviously, to, first of all, make sure that the incitement is being addressed most directly, and we are working very directly with him with respect to any aspects of incitement. I've called him on occasion to encourage him to condemn acts of violence. He has on occasion, but not with consistency, regrettably. But, you know, it takes two sides to come to the table, and both sides have to really begin to offer something and begin to talk about the modality of doing that. I don't think that the situation is helped by additional settlement construction and building. And I think that we know we need to see measures taken on both sides to indicate a readiness and willingness to try to proceed forward and reduce the violence. There is no question. I mean, the average Israeli is living with day-to-day threats on life that could come from anywhere, whether it's a scissors attack or a drive-by of somebody in an automobile. But I will call to everybody's attention that there were news reports just 2 days ago of the chief of the intelligence in Israel submitting a report to the government, and the headline of the report that I read out of the Israeli newspapers was that unless there is a peace process, there will be increased violence. So my hope is that everybody will take note of that, not as a threat, but as a sort of sense of reality about the downward spiral that comes if there isn't an active process by which is genuine, by the way. And I think that requires a slightly different formula than has existed previously. I believe Prime Minister Netanyahu is preparing some major initiatives with respect to economics and some changes on certain relationship components of the security relationship in the West Bank and other things. But I have been very clear that, and I think everybody believes, there has to be some kind of political horizon that both sides can understand, a reduction, an elimination of the violence, and a real readiness to move forward in real ways that people can grab onto and understand with respect to the creation of a state. If that can happen, then I think it's possible to have progress. But, you know, it's not in our hands. Now, with respect to the French proposal, we're evaluating it. We don't have all the details. We're trying to get some details about exactly what it would seek to achieve and how and what the rules of the road would be. But I think it's a reflection of the frustration that the international community feels that what is happening in the region, without blame, without pointing fingers, without anything, just what is happening, contributes to the overall instability and turmoil that you referred to earlier. So that's why it's urgent, and that's why we remain committed to Israel, committed to Israel's security, committed also, however, to trying to move the process forward and bring the parties to the table.
Let me just say, because my time is up, I appreciate your efforts, and I know how much time you spent on them. And I'm pleased to hear your commitment that the parties have to come to the table. As a result of Oslo, that's the only way that we can have two states for two people, and I want to express my appreciation, and I hope that means that you could not support a French proposal which would impose a solution on the parties through the United Nations.
Yeah, I don't know what their proposal is, but we've never supported something that is unfair to Israel or out of balance or, you know, that's never been the policy of our country.
Chairman Rogers.
Ukraine. In your budget request, you would slash funding for Ukraine activities by 55%, from $363 million down to $295. In the meantime, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2016 authorized $50 million for certain defensive lethal assistance. And so far, the only equipment that we have sent them has been non-lethal, and many people say that it's used and not very effective equipment at that. In the meantime, the government, the government that we support in Ukraine, is teetering. The Prime Minister just survived a no-confidence vote in Parliament. A lot of political turmoil, mainly due in part, I'm told, to the austerity reforms being implemented that have lowered standard of livings for the average Ukrainian. The IMF has not dispersed funds from its loan package since August. We can't get information out of the State Department. The budget request for 16 included $275 million for a $3 billion loan guarantee to the government of Ukraine. But the administration has not answered this subcommittee's questions about when it will be finalized. Can you help us?
Yeah, I don't know what, I mean, I can't speak to the lack of an answer as to when it would be finalized, but let me just speak to the
Perhaps
overall
someone in the
situation.
room that's with your staff could help us with that.
As to when it's going to be finalized, that's, I don't think the loan guarantee is currently under negotiation. It's the third loan guarantee that we have given. We put $2 billion on the table already in loan guarantees, and we're negotiating the third. But the uncertainties in the negotiation, Mr. Chairman, frankly, I don't think they can be laid at our doorstep. The reason the IMF has not been able to make a disbursement, and if you look at what Christine Lagarde sent, a 10-point requirement to the government in Kiev, requiring them to move forward on their reforms. And that's partly the reason for some of the turmoil that is going on. There's a significant amount of political disquiet. We've been addressing that very directly. Vice President Biden and I met with President Poroshenko in Switzerland a few weeks ago. We had further meetings in Munich. We've been pushing very hard to try to get the reforms in place that are frankly also required. Some of the steps that are required are as part of the Minsk process. So we're pushing on it. But the request of USAID assistance is $294.8 million, which is actually an increase of $103.4 million over the 2015 amount. You're right, it's less than 2016, but it's more than 2015, and it's calibrated to what can be absorbed and put to good use in the context of where they are. But they have probably a $20 billion gap overall. And I don't think that, what we're looking at is a situation where we need to have a significant reform effort, passage of laws. The Rada has to grab the bull by the horns here. President Poroshenko has to push these reforms through. And then there's a chance that this money will, in fact, reach the right people and do the right things.
Well, I hope I'm wrong in this, but I perceive that we're not doing all we need to do in Ukraine. And if that's so, it makes me wonder whether or not we are taking that position as a quid pro quo for Russia's assistance to us in Syria. Is that a possible angle here?
No, I think, look, we're very involved. We've had a series of conversations. President Obama raises the issue of Ukraine with President Putin in every conversation that he's had. And I met with President Putin a few months ago. We talked significantly about Ukraine. We talked about it when we met at the UN last September. This has been a constant effort to try to move that process forward. Now, it is principally negotiated in the Normandy format between the French, Germans, and the Russians, and we weigh in and we're involved in advisory fashion in that regard. So it's not appropriate for us to suddenly, try to link the two, and I think it'd be a mistake to do so. But Mr. Chairman, let me just say to you, I am ready to defend anywhere the amount of work that our department has done. Victoria Newland and our team, Jeff Pyatt, our ambassador, is superb and has done an extraordinary job working day to day to help move things forward. We actually were there, present for days, helping the RADA to be able to get the votes to pass some of the things that needed to be passed. So we are deeply, involved in ways that remain appropriate and sufficiently respecting the independence and sovereignty of the country, but we're pushing them and pushing them. We've elevated the fight against corruption. We're pushing the reform of the criminal justice system. We are enhancing their energy security by getting them to rely less on Russia. We've been strengthening their civil society. We've been working on their very, frankly, corrupt and difficult health system in order to transition it to a more effective model. We've taken huge defense reforms to modernize their military and security services. I mean, we are deeply involved in helping them, with other countries, I might add, to develop the capacity of governance necessary for the task that they face. And it is difficult. It is difficult ferreting out some of the levels of corruption that existed there previously. That's part of the challenge for President Poroshenko. That's part of the challenge that was put to him very directly by the IMF. And the point the IMF is making is they're not going to make a loan that's just going to be, wasted and squandered by virtue of a corrupt process. So this challenge is complex, but it is being tackled very, very directly by our very dedicated and frankly, very invested diplomats who want this to succeed.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service to your country.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lee.
Thank you, and thank you, Madam Chair, and our ranking member for this important hearing. And also, I want to thank Secretary Kerry. I want to thank you for being here today. And as we considered the President's last budget of his tenure, I want to just take a moment of personal privilege to thank you for your phenomenal work as our Secretary of State. It's really been a pleasure to work with you on so many issues, HIV and AIDS, Cuba, Iran. And I think your leadership has really demonstrated the fact that our international affairs budget really is a reflection of our values and ideals as a country. And you have really put that forward to the entire world. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
On Cuba, I was delighted to attend the reopening of the Cuban embassy in Havana with you. As you know, and this committee knows, I've been a strong advocate for ending the 50 years of failed policy with Cuba. And I'm also pleased to co-chair our bipartisan Cuba working group here in the House. How has the opening of diplomatic ties with Cuba changed the perception of the United States, and how has that impacted our ability to advance our agenda, for instance, with CARICOM and in the Western Hemisphere and throughout the world? Also, along those lines, I just want to ask you, in terms of our democracy programs in this committee and USAID, they know that I've been asking these questions since the incarceration of Alan Gross. How are these democracy programs now ensuring that contractors and subcontractors who work on them know what the laws are, whether we agree or not with the country's laws, that they could be, unfortunately, arrested if, in fact, they engage in these programs, so that they know up front that what risks they're taking in their participation with this, i.e. What happened with Alan Gross. And thank you for helping to make sure Alan got out.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Congresswoman Lee. I really appreciate your support in this effort. I know that some people disagreed with it, obviously. But I have to say that it is already creating change. You can see the transformation. There have been more than 50 delegations, congressional and cabinet, that have traveled now to Cuba in the last year. People have seen for themselves. There are regulatory changes that have taken place that have opened new opportunities for U.S. firms to export certain goods and services to Cuba. There have been agricultural delegations that have traveled there to explore how we could eventually, if the embargo is lifted, begin to change life for the Cuban people through better agricultural practices, better goods, actually sell American goods there, which we'd like to do. We signed off on our pilot program for direct transportation of mail, which ought to begin soon. We just signed a reestablished scheduled air service between the United States and Cuba for the first time in more than 50 years. And we've actually empowered a Cuban private sector that now employs 1 in 4 Cubans. The private sector is emerging. And people in the United States can now send unlimited remittances to support private businesses and private microfinance and entrepreneurial training activities and a broad range of tools, materials, and supplies for Cuban entrepreneurs. Now, I happen to believe, as does President Obama, and also the Cuban government has expressed its intent to expand development of communications and internet on the island, to have a target of 50% of its households connected to the internet by 2020. And we obviously endorse that. And the Cuban government recently opened 35 public Wi-Fi hotspots. So, things are changing. It's not going to happen overnight. We always said that. President Obama was very clear. The transition will take time. We are not happy with the movement in some regard on areas of human rights. There have been some political challenges, obviously, and we're going to continue to press those issues. The President will speak to those things directly when he goes to Cuba. But we feel very, very strongly that this policy was geared to address the hopes and aspirations of the people of Cuba, and that's what it's beginning, in fact, to do, to take hold. And we believe nothing would speak to the Cuban people's aspirations and needs more than lifting the embargo so that we can not have to wrestle with everything that we're trying to do, but just let it happen. And I think what's happened in Eastern Europe is the greatest witness to what happens when you open up and allow the world to come in. And there are other places that respect that too. Myanmar, other people have been on a transition to democracy. So, Congresswoman, I think with respect, our embassy is taking great care to make sure that people understand the rules, aren't stepping over any lines. We have, one of the things we negotiated was an ability to increase the number of diplomats in Cuba, and we're in the process of doing that with this budget. We've asked you for the additional slots and funding for that.
Thank you so much. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Madam Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good to see you, sir.
Thank you.
By the way, I was taken back that you mentioned as a success the U.S. ag sales and independent business licenses when both numbers are actually down. But let me, so it's an interesting thing that would be the success story. Today is the 20th anniversary of the murder of 3 Americans and 1 American resident in international airspace ordered, according to himself, he himself decided by Castro. Just days before that, the President announced that he would be traveling to Cuba. Now, in December 2015, the President said that any trip of his to Cuba would be conditioned on improvement of human rights on the island. You yourself just said that that's been an area where things have not looked good. Facts. Let me put some facts on the table. Last year, there were documented 8,616 political arrests in Cuba, a huge increase. Several political prisoners on the Obama-Castro list of 53 have since been rearrested. Cuba remains as the only country in the Americas to be classified as not free by Freedom House. Mr. Secretary, by any objective measure, the Castro regime has not improved its human rights records. If anything, it has gotten worse. So, please, again, facts. Please reassure us and give us some facts of where the human rights situation has improved to reassure us that President Obama is not breaking his word of December 15th when he said that he would not visit if human rights conditions had not improved. Where specifically, Mr. Secretary, have the human rights conditions in Cuba on the island improved?
Well, The agreement required a large number of people to be released, as you know, it was about 50.
53, and a number of them, Mr. Secretary, have been rearrested.
Correct, and we believe they will be released as is appropriate, and that signifies some listening, some movement. The fact that 50 of them were released.
And rearrested.
And yes, we were disappointed that 4, I think it was 4 or 5, we've registered that. We're very disappointed.
Where
in that.
specifically have human rights and conditions improved?
But the President and we always said, it's not, that component is not going to change as rapidly as other components, but it's changing. And you have to look at other countries that have gone through and are going through these kinds of transitions. I mean, we deal with China. China's probably our biggest, I think they're, holds the most debt of the United States, one of the largest traders with the United States, and we disagree with China on human rights.
Mr. Secretary, I hate that time is where specifically have human rights improved? I would like you to reassure us the President is not breaking his word when in December in 2015, he said he would not go unless human rights conditions improved. I just want you to reassure me. Please give me some facts.
They have improved in the sense that 53 prisoners who were in jail for political reasons were released. And I believe these others will be released. And I think that'll be, and the President is going to engage in this human rights discussion. I'm engaging in this discussion. We just met with the finance minister of Cuba the other day. I talked to my colleague on a regular basis about this. I may be going down there before the President to have this discussion to some degree. So we're continuing to push on it. But
I don't hear any facts here, Mr. Secretary. You mentioned, for example, as a success ags, but we know that the facts show that ag sales are down. Again, you keep mentioning, which I appreciate, that there were 53 released. A number of them have been rearrested. There were over, I just mentioned the number, 8,000 arrests, political arrests, not to mention the 200 arrests every Sunday of the ladies in white, the beatings of these women who were just trying to go to church on Sundays. So I'm just trying to see. I don't want to be argumentative. I'm just trying to see if you can give us some facts.
I gave you facts.
So you're telling me that with 8,000 arrests.
And people are engaged. 1 in 4 people in the country are now engaged in the private sector.
And the licenses are down. The licenses are down.
Beg your pardon?
The licenses of these so-called private independent businesses, the numbers have decreased.
There are an increased number of private businesses. There is a capacity to provide finance. There are people who are now being able to open businesses who weren't before.
Do you have any of those numbers? Because again, the numbers that we have.
Well, I'll get the specific numbers for you. I don't have.
I just want you to reassure us, because again, I just keep hearing in platitudes.
I'm trying to reassure you, but you don't want to be reassured.
Mr. Secretary, you have not given me any numbers.
Well, I'll get the numbers to you. We'll get you the numbers.
So you have no numbers. And so, again, please reassure me. The President said he would not visit unless human rights improved. You're mentioning 53 political prisoners, out of which a number of them have been rearrested, when there have been over 8,000 arrests. In anybody's math, fuzzy math or not, that's not a pretty good ratio when you have 8,000 arrests, 53 supposedly released, and a number of them have been rearrested. That's not, again, please, if you could get back to us, reassure us that the President is not breaking this red line when he said he would not visit until there was a substantial improvement in human rights, sir.
I'm happy
to
get
see
the details on it, Congressman.
Our time is up. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Before I call on Mr. Rupersberger, between Christmas and New Year's, I traveled to Costa Rica because I kept reading the stories of the Cubans that were going through Ecuador, from Cuba, Ecuador to Costa Rica. And so I went to see them and to ask them why they were leaving. And the answer that I got personally was that there had been such a clampdown in Cuba since the deal was made with the United States that they felt like the only time they could leave was now. That was my experience. And I'm going back. Mr. Rupersberger, please.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. And I believe right now that this is one of the most dangerous periods for the United States throughout the world, whether China-Russia threat, terrorism threat, Iran, all these different issues. I want to get into the issue of Iran, though. We had a lot of debate, and the agreement went forward with Iran. I think the focal point of the agreement, which a lot of individuals or a lot of people didn't see it this way, was to stop Iran from having nuclear weapons. It would have changed the Middle East, the makeup of the Middle East, and it could have been very dangerous. And as we know, Israel is one of our most important and closest allies, and their security is very important to us, and we stand behind them. Now, According to the State Department, and I'm going to ask two questions, but according to the State Department, Iran continues to still be the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. And its quest to dominate the Middle East, expel our influence, that type of thing. They're very active in Iran, in Iraq, in Bahrain, Yemen, Lebanon, Palestine, Central America. Quds Force is very active in a lot of these areas. What I want to, the two questions I'm going to ask, number one, is that what is the status after we have the agreement as far as the focal point of, number one, the issue of nuclear weapons? Where are we? Do we feel secure that the goal has been reached? We have independent examination. We want to make sure those examinations and continue to move forward. And the second issue is the issue of exporting terrorism. Can you talk about other sanctions? I think it's important that we understand that the United States still has, through the United Nations, we have a lot of sanctions on Iran as we speak now as it relates to their exporting of terrorism. And I think it's important that you discuss those, what they are, and an example, if Hezbollah, Iran transfers money to Hezbollah for the benefit of Hezbollah, would U.S. immediately sanction the bank that did that, those type of issues? So those are the two issues: status of the agreement, where we are now, and secondly, what we're doing as far as Iran exporting terrorism and the sanctions that exist there.
Okay. Well, Congressman, Iran is compliant with the requirements of the JCPOA to date. There have been a couple of issues of interpretation of one thing or another that we have worked through in the mechanism that we set up to work it through, and it's been resolved. And they have taken some 19,000 centrifuges and reduced them to 5,060. They've taken their 12,000 kilograms of stockpile and reduced it to the requisite 300 kilograms that cannot be enriched above 3.67%. They've taken the calandria, which is the core of the plutonium reactor, which was being built, not yet commissioned. They've taken it out and destroyed it, filled it with concrete. IAEA inspected, dried concrete, it's destroyed, cannot be used again. They have ceased all fissionable enrichment process at Fordow, stored the appropriate centrifuges in the appropriate places, allowed the inspections to take place. And so, in effect, they've moved the heavy water out, and it's on the market for sale. They've moved their enriched uranium out. The ship is now in Russia. Russians took that, where the highly enriched uranium. So every aspect of what we laid out as a requirement has been, in fact, carried out, which is why implementation day took place appropriately with the IAEA signing off on it. Now, we will continue, obviously, and this was the whole purpose of the agreement, is what we promised the Congress and the American people and the world. There will be an ongoing process of extremely intrusive but agreed upon verification of the continued compliance with this agreement. And our intel community and energy department, which is responsible for our own nuclear weapons, have assured us that they believe they are capable of knowing exactly what is going on and the compliance is taking place. Now, with respect to Iran's other activities, we purposefully left in place the regimens for other sanctions. So sanctions for support of terror, for instance, sanctions for missile test, sanctions for arms embargo, all of those are existent, sanctions for human rights. And we continue to monitor those. In fact, on January 17th, we designated some 3 entities, and I think 8 individuals, 7 or 8 individuals, for violations with respect to the missile launch that had taken place previously. So we've put Iran on notice that those compliance measures will, in fact, be utilized, and we will continue to observe. Now, the Iranians have We've intercepted, in fact, one Dow ship, a boat, large boat, that was taking arms, we believe, to Yemen. And we also turned away a convoy very close to the period when we were completing the agreement, and that convoy turned back because we singled it out and said this would be a violation. So it wasn't violated because it went back and they never did, in fact, send the arms. But the effort was attempted. So that shows you how acutely we are watching it and how we've been able to actually have an impact.
Thank you.
Mr. Dent.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Mr. Secretary.
Morning.
I'm not expecting an answer to this question, but maybe one of your folks after the meeting could help me with this. It has to do with Colombian truck scrappage, believe it or not. American truck manufacturers, including some up in my district, recently welcomed the news that Colombia may be eliminating its one-for-one truck scrapping requirement, which requires an old truck to be scrapped for every new truck purchased. However, we have heard that this change may include a caveat that the requirement would only be eliminated for certain types of trucks, which would still pose a problem for many American manufacturers. And obviously, we have a Colombian trade agreement, and this is a real source of concern for many. So the question I have is, what specific actions does the administration intend to take if Colombia continues to restrict its market for American-made trucks? So I'm not expecting you to have an answer at this moment, but I would like somebody to at least be able to get back to me, unless you do have an answer.
No, Congressman, your expectation is going to be met. I don't. But I promise you we'll get back to you very quickly.
And the second question deals with Syria. As this committee considers the administration's request for funding to aid in the fight against ISIS, I have to ask, what do you see as our end game in this region, as it appears now that the Russians have successfully shored up the Assad regime and simultaneously increased their own clout in the Middle East? We've also seen Hezbollah and Iran, Iranian fighters increasingly engaged in that conflict as well on the side of Damascus. Meanwhile, Turkey appears to be using the conflict as an excuse to wage war against the Kurds, many of whom are actively fighting against ISIS. And you know the whole drill there. And of course, the Turks are more interested in taking down Assad, it seems, at the moment than fighting ISIS. Very complicated, convoluted situation. And, you know, I guess the issue for me is, what is our end game in Syria diplomatically? And just as importantly, is there a viable Sunni political infrastructure in Syria that is not radical and that could actually govern in the event we ever reached an agreement?
Well, the answer to your last question is yes. There are Sunni who are extremely capable and moderate and very qualified business people, very capable potential contributors to a resolution. But we don't want to divide this thing up or talk about it in the context of Sunni, Shia, Alawite, whatever. And it's up to the Syrians. I mean, the Syrians have got to make that kind of a decision, which is why we are so supportive of the political process. Now, you ask, what is the end game? The end game is actually shared, or at least in statements and positions publicly put forward. The end game is stated by Iran, by Russia, by the United States, by the European community, and by the Arab countries. All share the notion of a Syria that is united, whole, stable, peaceful, protecting all minorities, in which you have the ability of the Syrian people through an election to choose their leadership, free of coercion and of interference, and free of foreign fighters and free of Daesh and so forth. Now, how do you get there? And by the way, the Iranians and the Russians have signed on to that in the context of UN Security Council Resolution 2254, and they have also issued 2 communiques in the context of the Vienna meetings where they have embraced exactly what I just described, a whole unified Syria in which Syrian people decide the future. Now, Russia has long supported Assad. This is not a surprise to anybody that Russia is supporting Assad. Russia also has a very specific interest in preventing terrorists from coming back to Russian soil. There are probably more than 2,000, not probably, there are more than 2,000 Chechens fighting in Syria as part of the radical extremist elements. And Russia doesn't want them coming back and fighting them. So part of the Russian strategy was to shore up Assad, who they feared might have been about to fall to Daesh and to Nusra. So their concerns were that this would be greatly destabilizing them. Now, they have other ulterior geographic, geostrategic, and other interests, and we understand that. But while Russia has succeeded in shoring up Assad, that doesn't end the process for Russia, because Russia's there and on the ground, and holding territory is hard. And if you have a persistent and continued insurgency against that government, and you will if there is no peace, that's a problem for Russia. So in the long run, Russia has an interest, we think, in trying to work towards a legitimate political transition that can provide stability and a change in Syria.
Without Assad, a transition without Assad?
We believe it cannot happen except without Assad. And the reason is that if you have barrel-bombed your people and gassed your people and tortured your people and starved your people, it is very hard to envision how you can take 12 million people who've been displaced, driven out of the country, and with over 400,000 killed, and have that guy sit there and say, oh, okay, everything's fine, let's go status quo ante. It's not going to happen. And Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi, and others, and the opposition have made it very clear war will not end if Assad stays. So Russia has to confront that. Iran has to confront that. And they have signed on, at least, to a structure that begins to confront that. The reality will be the test in the next few weeks and months. Are they really supporting a genuine process of transition? And we will know very quickly whether that's for real or not. But if you really want to end the war, there's no way, it seems to me, to be able to ultimately do that without some kind of negotiated outcome. And it's going to require some compromise. So we're going to have to plow ahead. I'm not vouching for the fact that this ceasefire will absolutely work and take place, but it's the one way to get to the discussion of the future of Assad and the possibility of a political transition. And since Iran and Russia have signed on to the idea of this political transition expressed in the Geneva Communique of 2012, we have to put that to the test. And President Obama is deeply committed to exhausting the diplomatic possibilities before we have to confront, if we have to, whatever Plan B might have to be.
Thank you. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you. I want to first just recognize that next month marks the 9th year of anguish for Robert Levinson's family. And as heartwarming as it was to see our American citizens come home from Iran earlier this year, we still have had no progress on locating his whereabouts or moving towards being able to help bring him home and end his family's pain and return him to his home in South Florida. And so I appreciate your efforts, the efforts of President Obama and the administration, but would just underscore how important it is to continue to press Iran for their assertion, which has no credibility whatsoever, that they have absolutely no idea where he is or anything to do with his disappearance. And sticking with Iran, obviously following the Iran agreement, which I supported, the most important step we have to take now is to make sure that we have a strong MOU, new MOU with Israel that I know we're in the midst of negotiating. And I had an opportunity to speak with Ambassador Shapiro at the end of last week, and we had a good conversation. But could you update us on where we are? And I know you can't go into excruciating detail here in this setting, but could you update us on the progress that we've made on finalizing that MOU with Israel? Because obviously making sure that we can maintain their security and continue to make sure that with the tumult that continues to occur all around them, that they have the ability to keep their national security interests strong and protect their people. And particularly my concern is that with the language that I am told is being included, that Congress be able to maintain our ability to continue to increase the support that is essential for Israel to keep her people safe.
Mr. Secretary, before you begin, we've got until 12 o'clock, and I want to make sure we get around to all the members.
Absolutely. I'll try to be really quick. All right. Just very quickly on Robert Levinson, let me just make it clear. There is a process. And in fact, we wrote into the agreement that saw the folks come back the other day a very specific inclusion of an ongoing dialogue and process on Bob Levinson. I met with the family just recently. I know they were disappointed. I understand that. I'm very sympathetic to that. And how can you not be when you see people come back and you're wondering what happened after all these years? But as I told them, and we have said publicly, we just have not had a proof of life since the last one. I think it was 2007, am I correct? 2007 or 8 or somewhere in there. 2010, excuse me. And that was the last time, and I am pursuing personally the obvious questions that flow from the moment of that last proof. What happened? And I've raised this very directly with my counterpart. We are trying to see if we can trace that back and work on that. So there is a process in place, and we are determined, and President Obama will not rest easy until we have exhausted every possibility, and we're going to try and get him back, if that can be done. With respect to the MOU, we are negotiating. We've had a 10-year MOU. It doesn't expire until 2018, but we'd like to get it done. You, Hall, and the United States have given $3.1 billion a year for 10 years. There will be more, there is no doubt, because of the needs and because of the increased security process. We've done a very strong evaluation of what it is. We are taking into account all of the QME issues for Israel. I think it's fair to say that the level of cooperation with Israel, notwithstanding the disagreement over the Iran agreement, the cooperation on a day-to-day basis has really just never been higher, better. We have Iron Dome. We have constant communication. We're working very closely with Israel, and I have no doubt that an MOU will be reached. An MOU will have a larger amount, subject to your judgments, and we will continue to provide Israel with the security that it needs and help it to be able to defend itself by itself.
And our ability as members of Congress to be able to address crises and emergency provisions.
For sure.
And we've always had that, but
Yeah.
there have been discussions that our ability to do that might be restricted in the MOU, and so I want to make sure that.
I'm not aware of that detail at this point. Let me check on it. Debbie, I'll get back to you.
Lastly, it's just, you alluded to that the current MOU expires in 2018. Obviously, the situation.
Everybody
in the
wants this
region-
ahead of time for planning purposes.
Yes,
I think
well, and also because the circumstances have dramatically shifted, given that we have entered into an Iran agreement, which, as I said, I supported, and I thought it was the appropriate way to keep Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon, but we also have to address the security concerns.
For sure, and they will be.
Thank you.
Mr. Rooney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, last July I introduced legislation with the co-chairs of the South Sudan caucus, including Congresswoman Barbara Lee, requiring the President to submit to Congress a strategy to support the UN peacekeeping mission in the South Sudan, to investigate human rights abuses and ease intensifying humanitarian crisis. The bill also directs the administration to pursue high-level engagement with regional and like-minded governments in order to better promote a better environment for the resolution of this crisis, and to halt the flow of arms from all external sources, and to support the creation, implementation, and enforcement of the UN Security Council arms embargo and targeted individual sanctions on all parties to the conflict in South Sudan. While I was cautiously hopeful about the signing of the peace agreement, I felt and still feel strongly that in order for it to succeed, that U.S. leadership and long-term planning is obviously critical. U.S. officials from the past and current administrations have been intimately involved and demonstrated incredible leadership to bring an end to the 17-year civil war between the North and the South. As you know, 5 years ago, the South Sudanese people finally achieved independence, and the U.S. gained a strong ally in South Sudan. But this civil war is devastating, obviously, and it shouldn't deter the U.S. from engaging in aggressive diplomacy to prevent another generation from a lifetime of war, the impact of which we are seeing manifests itself from around the world. I commend the UN panel of experts for conducting what must have been an extremely harrowing investigation in South Sudan, and I'm hopeful that their work will compel the international community to fully recognize the intensity and atrocities committed throughout the Civil War, ranging from systematic rape and mutilation of women and girls to the recruitment and exploitation of children soldiers. Mr. Secretary, I'd like to ask you sort of a long question because I might not be able to chime back in, but I just wanted to say, as you know, this country is 5 years old. And if we can offer any words here today of optimism for their future there, specifically with regard to missed deadlines, ceasefire violations, attack on humanitarian workers, restrictive laws against the press and civil society, NGOs. So we can assume that this peace agreement may be deemed a failure. What does the U.S. have in plans to facilitate the immediate coordination of African leaders, the EU, and other UNSC members to impose targeted sanctions on individuals who've committed violations of international humanitarian and human rights laws, and to enact an arms embargo so that we can try to save the ceasefire, the peace agreement, and the future of the South Sudan?
Well, Congressman, first of all, let me thank you for your focus on this. It's really important, and I really appreciate the detail and depth of your concern about this. The United States is the largest donor in the world since this conflict began to the challenge of Sudan, South Sudan, $1.5 billion. And we have been deeply involved. President Obama has been personally involved when he went over to Ethiopia. He held meetings. He has had personal conversations. I've had personal conversations. I traveled to Juba as secretary and had conversations with President Kiir. I can't tell you how many phone calls I've had with President Kiir and with Riek Machar. And we have pushed very, very hard towards this peace process. We have Ambassador Don Booth has been diligently working away as a special envoy under very difficult circumstances. I don't think South Sudan has a better friend than the United States, and we have pushed very, very hard to have compliance with the international community's desire to end the conflict. They're at a critical stage now. There is the security forces for Riek Machar have now arrived in Juba. He is supposed to go there at some point in time to try to fulfill the mission of having this unity government as part of the peace process. And we have a very real agenda of post-conflict reconstruction, of criminal justice, transitional justice as part of the conflict resolution. We've committed $5 million to accountability to try to help lead in this process, in addition to the aid and other things we're doing. But the bottom line you raised at the end of your question, the sanctions. My message to South Sudan and to the leaders in the process is very simple. This takes leadership. If President Kiir and the people around him and Riek Machar and the people around him don't take on responsibility and deliver on this peace agreement, then the international community is absolutely prepared to put in place individual sanctions for a range of things, ranging from the corruption to property that may be held in other places to the crimes that may have been committed in the course of the war. And we're very serious about that. This is a critical moment for South Sudan's survival, and it's important for people who hold themselves up to be leaders to actually lead.
Thank you. Mr. Serrano.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your work, for your service to our country in many capacities. For many years, we always heard about Latin American countries telling us, why you guys have this policy with Cuba, why don't you change it? Is it too early to notice whether they appreciate it? Is it too early to see a change in what Latin American countries are saying about that change we made?
Not in the least. We have been amazed by the receptivity of countries throughout Latin America as a result of this. It has changed our relationship with other countries in the region, and it has changed their relationship with Cuba and even with Venezuela. It has established credibility for the United States in terms of our goals and hopes, and it really has opened up. There's now a dialogue that is opening up that we may be taking part in with respect to Venezuela, and the credibility we have for that has come out of this transition in Cuba.
That's great. That's wonderful. And I tell you, it was a special day in Cuba for Barbara Lee. It was a special day for all of us in Washington to see that flag go up. I thought I'd never see that happen, certainly in my time in Congress and maybe in my lifetime. Yeah. So thank you for your work. On a more mundane type question, you have to switch now from an interest section that used to blare messages to the Cuban people and against the government to an embassy that behaves in a diplomatic fashion and so on. Physically and politically, is the change difficult, or is it a transition?
Well, it is. It's not. I wouldn't call it. I wouldn't call it difficult. It has its challenges, yes, because we still have some limitations on the amount of equipment that we can bring in. But we broke through with an increase that we haven't had in years, so that we can refurbish the embassy, improve the equipment, have people be able to do a better job of managing the increased numbers of Americans now traveling. That's very important. We negotiated an increase in the number of diplomats that can be there. They are now able to travel throughout Cuba in greater numbers, and this will be important to being able to ascertain the needs of the Cuban people and being able to help us to do good diplomacy. So I think that, you know, as we've gone through this transition, we're recognizing that it's going to require additional funds from the committee. We've asked for that. But I think over the course of time, this will evolve. There's a natural growth. There's also some building of trust in the process as we go forward here. They have to see that we are, in fact, adhering to the Vienna Convention and engaged in diplomacy and not other things. And we have to see that they are, in fact, improving human rights and improving the opportunities for their people. And that's how you will build a transition over a period of time.
Okay, and I'll close with this. Is it true you're negotiating a Major League Baseball team in Cuba already?
No, I think there's been some discussion about whether or not there might be a visit at some point in time, appropriately, of a team, but I have nothing to do with any other negotiations. So.
Thank you, Mr. Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks.
Mr. Secretary, I had the extraordinary privilege of being in the room with Pope Francis when he, in a very powerful moment, was given a small cross, a Christian crucifix. That crucifix had belonged to a young Syrian man who had been captured by the jihadists, and he was told to choose, convert or die. And he chose his ancient faith tradition. He chose Christ, and he was beheaded. His mother was able to recover the body, recover this cross, and bury him, and she fled to Austria, which set the stage for this moment which I witnessed. Mr. Secretary, this is repeating itself over and over and over again against Christians, Yazidis, and other religious minorities in the region. In 2004, Colin Powell, when he was Secretary of State, came before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I believe you served on that committee at that point, and declared what was happening in Darfur to be a genocide. There are 200 members of Congress in a bipartisan fashion. We've put our names on a resolution that is forthcoming that declares this genocide. There is a growing international consensus in this regard. The European Parliament has passed something similar. The U.S. Catholic bishops, Pope Francis has spoken out. Hillary Clinton has called it such, Marco Rubio, the International Association of Genocide Scholars. I want to note as well a word of thanks to you and President Obama for the quick action on Mount Sinjar that actually saved the lives of women and children, countless persons who would have been wiped out and victimized. And so what I'm urging here today is that you use the authority and power of your office to call this genocide, to help restore the rich tapestry of the ancient faith traditions in the Middle East, to stop this assault on human dignity and civilization itself, and to set potentially the conditions that we're all hoping and praying for that reestablish the stability and reintegration of these ancient faith traditions into the fabric of the communities in the Middle East entirely. I think the stability, the future stability of the entire region depends upon this.
Well, again, Congressman, thank you for a very moving and eloquent description of the problem, and I appreciate you were lucky to be in that room to witness that, and certainly appreciate your reactions to it, and I share just a huge sense of revulsion over these acts, obviously. None of us have ever seen anything like it in our lifetimes, though obviously if you go back to the Holocaust, the world has seen it. We are currently doing what I have to do, which is review very carefully the legal standards and precedents for whatever judgment is made. I can tell you we are doing that. I've had some initial recommendations made to me. I've asked for some further evaluation, and I will make a decision on this, and I will make a decision on it as soon as I have that additional evaluation, and we will proceed forward from there. But I understand how compelling it is. Christians have been moved in many parts now of the Middle East, I might add. This is not just in Syria, but in other places there has been a increased forced evacuation and displacement, which is equally disturbing, though it's not, you know, they aren't killing them in that case, but it's a removal and a cleansing ethnically and religiously, which is deeply disturbing. So we are very much focused on this, and as I say, I will make a judgment soon.
They've taken the conditions for life as well as life away from Christians, Yazidis, and religious minorities. And I bring up the declaration by former Secretary of State Colin Powell to demonstrate the power that the declaration actually has, because in doing so, he helped put a stop to that grim reality there in Darfur. I know you share deep sympathies in this regard. I just urge you, plead with you, partner with us. There is a growing consensus that this is not only true and real, but I think, again, it sets the condition for whatever future settlement we have to have. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service. And I have to say, I'm just a little old congressman, and I really mean that. I don't have the background that you do, but we view the world in a very different way. If men are from Mars and women are from Venus, we got kind of a whole Mars, Venus, Pluto thing going on here. And let me give you a couple examples, if I could. You said in your opening statement that you believe our alliance with Europe is strong and getting stronger. As a member of a Congress, especially as a member of Intel Committee, I have a chance to travel and talk with world leaders. And this is what I hear again and again. Where is the United States? We don't know if we can trust you. We don't know if you're going to stand by alliances that have been in place for generations in some cases. We don't know if you're going to stand up to your adversaries. And evidence of that isn't something that I see. It's not anecdotal. It's not something that I've read in newspapers. It's my own personal experience. Another example, if I could, you said that you were confident that we would defeat, you said Daesh, but most of us refer to ISIS or ISIL. I just don't believe this administration has a plan or the will to defeat them, and I'm certainly not alone in that concern. And with that being said, that we come from this from a different view, there's so many questions I would like to ask you. It's a target-rich environment. I'd like to ask one quickly and then turn to Syria. Your own State Department has told us that the former secretary has kept something more than 1,600 classified emails on an unsecured server, of which your State Department classified 29 at least as top secret. And recognizing that the definition of top secret is that their exposure would potentially cause exceptionally grave damage to national security. Top secret is not a trifling thing. And so I wanted to read these emails. I wanted to know what was in them and what had potentially been exposed. And I'm curious, Mr. Secretary, have you read these emails that were classified as top secret that were kept on the former secretary's private server?
So let me answer the questions there that I think are relevant to the budget and the policy. On DASH, yes, we have a plan. Let me be clear
Well, Mr. Secretary, I wasn't asking that question. I know that we just view that.
You did ask a question. You said you don't think that we have a plan, and I want to make it clear we have a plan.
Okay. Well,
and we're going to defeat. Let me just finish now.
Well, actually, Mr. Secretary, this is my time, and I didn't ask that question.
Well, I thought it was your time to ask a question.
Well, and my question was, have you read Secretary Clinton's emails that were on her server that have been classified as top secret?
No, I have not. It's not my job to do that. It's being thoroughly vetted through another process, and I think you know that.
Well, like me, though, it's not necessarily my job to vet that, but I was curious what was on those emails and what would be classified as top secret, so I went ahead and read them. I would encourage you to, sir, because I think that there's information on there that, as a secretary in your position, that you would want to know, I would think, what had potentially been exposed. If I could, in the last 2 minutes...
We have appropriate people who are managing that through appropriate channels, and I think you know that.
Well, I certainly do.
And I don't think it's appropriate to be characterizing something that the world can't read, which is being taken care of with more than 50 investigations by 8 or 9 committees. Honestly.
But Mr. Secretary,
so let's not fool around here. Let's
Mr.
talk
Secretary,
about the serious
I didn't
issues.
characterize those. It was your own department that characterized
No,
those.
you just characterized them without, you said, I read them, and I think it's important for people to have a sense of whatever. That's a characterization.
Well, the characterization of being top secret is not something that I characterize.
Right,
But,
and things get classified after the fact, and it happens in the Senate and the House. You folks send things on your BlackBerries, and you send them sometimes from a foreign country.
But having
and
read
are they
these emails,
classified?
I can assure you that this isn't a case of being overclassified. Having read them, I know that.
So let's come back to DASH, because that's really important to the American people. And DASH, we have taken back, the Iraqis have taken back 40% of the territory that they held in Iraq. We've liberated Tikrit. They have liberated Tikrit. They've liberated Ramadi. They're now moving on Heat. They're going to be doing that in Mosul. We've cut off the main road between Raqqa and Mosul. The secondary roads are being cut off. There have been more than 10,000 airstrikes. People have been eliminated from the battlefield. We're eliminating their money. They've cut their money to their fighters by 50%, in some cases eliminated it. We're taking away their source of revenue. There is and President Obama made it clear at the very beginning, this was not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time.
Well,
now, there are a lot of people in that part of the world who are happy to fight to the last American. And the fact is that we are trying to do this without having the last American on the ground, but rather getting forces there, training them, working them. We have special forces on the ground. Americans are in Syria. Americans are on the ground in Iraq. We are helping them to help themselves. And I think most Americans believe that's a pretty good way to get it done. Well, I've heard the hand-wringing, and I referred to the hand-wringing in the beginning of my comments. I hear it. But we are making a difference. We've reassured Europe. We're going up to a $3.4 billion. We have redeployed troops. We rotate troops through the forward frontline countries. And frankly, we do more than any other country in the world.
Well, of course we do more than any other country. We are the United States, and my time is up, so I'll just conclude with this. There's no question we've made some progress with there. I wouldn't say that that isn't true. I would say, and you call it hand-wringing in a pejorative way, as if it's, we're children who are just, sitting
Because
over here
it
fretting,
doesn't
but there are
comport with
legitimate.
the facts, Congressman.
There are
The
legitimate
facts are that we are
concerns.
getting these things done.
Well,
The
Mr.
facts are that
Secretary,
we are provided for these folks.
we could have an exchange about whether we're getting these things done, but it is a legitimate concern on many of our part whether this administration has the will and the plan to move forward on this and to actually defeat them. Because I'm not the only one who questions whether that's the case. And it's not only Americans who question that as well. Many of our allies do. Madam Chairman, I apologize for going over. I yield
Thank
back.
you. We have
Can
one.
I just say, Madam
We have
Madam
one
Chairman,
last question from Ms. Lowy and from me. Ms. Lowy?
Madam Chair, I just want to say I think the discussion of the emails in this forum, when we have the whole world that is challenging us, seems inappropriate. And if I'm not mistaken, in all the discussions I've heard, that Secretary Colin Powell had the same system in place. And in fact, the emails that were sent to both Secretary Powell and Secretary Clinton were not classified at the time they were sent.
That's correct.
So I think in looking at the whole process, and I'm sure you as the Secretary of State are looking at the whole process, but I don't think this is the appropriate forum
But I
for us
believe you
to
did have a
deal with
question,
it.
didn't you?
And I did have another question. Thank you so much. What I was so concerned about, Secretary Kerry, when you were talking about arms shipment outside of the JCPOA being turned around, and isn't it wonderful that they were turned around? My reaction was, is this a cat and mouse game, or is there a real understanding with Iran that they have a responsibility to comply with the UN sanctions, the other sanctions in place, and they shouldn't be arming other nations in the region that are just causing one incident after another where people are dying. So I'm a little puzzled about that and why Iran is not complying with the other sanctions that are very clearly in place.
I think, Congresswoman, what you have is sometimes independent actions by independent entities. It's very hard to measure. But as you know, the IRGC opposed the Iran agreement bitterly.
Right.
The IRGC wanted to have a nuclear umbrella, and the IRGC resented. The IRGC does certain things. And so we, in contacting the government, made it clear that we would take steps if indeed they were going to deliver anything. And since nothing was delivered, there was a response that seemed to be appropriate. Now, it's not a cat and mouse game, no. If we find something happening, we're going to respond as we did on the missile launch.
May I ask you, because I know we're all going to be cut off and you have to
Yeah.
leave, but Mr. Secretary, with great respect, when you said the IRGC is independent,
No, I said sometimes things happen. I'm not saying that. We don't know what happened. What we do know is that nothing happened. We didn't have a transfer. We don't know for sure what was on there. We didn't inspect it. So we saw a convoy, and we told them it'd be better not to push the envelope here, and they didn't. Now, I don't know specifically what was loaded in there or what, but I'm just saying to you that I think you need to have your facts. When we have the facts, like a missile launch, we responded, and we will in the future. We do know also that there are weapons that have come out of Iran, gone through Damascus, gone to Lebanon, and we've made it very clear, that that's an invitation to response. No question about it.
because we're limited on time, I will pursue this with Secretary Liu because I understand these sanctions are being overseen by his department. Treasury is responsible for this series of sanctions, and I think it has to be made very clear that this is unacceptable, even if we don't catch you. Thank you.
Well, I mean,
Thank you.
Thank you for your
if you
work.
know what it is, yeah.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Secretary, the committee's given the administration significant funding and flexibility to address global health threats. including broad authority to use funds to address a public health emergency of international concern. Of course, that's Zika, which has been declared by the World Health Organization. Mr. Secretary, to use this authority, you have to declare it in the national interest to respond to such emergency. I'm going to ask a quick question because all I need is one word, yes or no. Do you intend to make this declaration so you can access existing funds immediately to fight the Zika outbreak?
Yeah. You're right. We do. I do have that ability, and the Zika virus is still being analyzed and evaluated with respect to exactly what it's going to require, how much it's going to require. We're concerned about it, which is why we requested the additional money. But we're also concerned about Ebola on the other side possibly resurging. And yes, there is some money left over in there, but we don't know how much either one is really going to demand. So we're loath to take what's already been appropriated for Ebola with Zika coming down the line and yet to be determined how big and how broad it's going to be. So it's premature to make that decision. I'm well aware of the authority, obviously. If it suddenly started to move more rapidly and we had a greater sense of broad threat to the public, which required a more immediate response, obviously we'd move in a more, we'd move in an emergency way to take from wherever. But right now, that's just not the way to deal with it in our judgment. We're trying to keep them on separate tracks.
As we conclude the hearing today, I want to raise an issue that I continue to hear about from my constituents and also for members. So for this one, just please provide for the record an update on the refugee screening process and highlight what changes have been made to the process to better ensure that refugees admitted for resettlement in the United States do not pose a threat to our country or the community in which they are resettled. That came up about the Syrians that we were looking at.
Yep.
So if you do submit that for the record, I thank you again for your time. I thank you for your energy and all the effort you've given to world crises, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, I just want to say to you, thank you. You've been terrific. When I've needed to call you urgently, you've been available, and likewise, Ranking Member, and you both have been enormously helpful, and we're very grateful for the bipartisan effort. Thank you.
This concludes today's hearing, and members may submit any additional questions for the record. The Subcommittee on State, Foreign Operations, and Related Programs stands adjourned.